My name is Mark Bennett, and I'm 41 years old. 7 months ago, I buried my wife and our 2 children alone while my parents were at my sister's birthday party. When I called them shaking, barely able to breathe, and told them that Laura, Ethan, and Caleb had been killed by a drunk driver, my father didn't raise his voice or ask questions. He said, "Today is your sister's birthday. We can't come." Those words didn't just end a phone call. They ended the version of me that kept sacrificing, forgiving, and pretending this family loved me back. What my parents didn't know was that my family's death triggered something they never saw coming. The $4.2 million life insurance payout was only the beginning. The real shock came months later, when my name appeared on the front page of the local paper, and they realized what I had built out of the wreckage they ignored. Before I take you back to the morning that changed everything, like and subscribe if you've ever been treated as expendable by the people who should have protected you. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Now let me tell you about the day my family chose a party over my children's funeral. The day itself didn't arrive with thunder or warning signs. It arrived quietly, almost politely, like it didn't want to disturb anyone. I woke up expecting the usual chaos, small feet running down the hallway, Laura already awake and halfway through her coffee, Ethan arguing about which bowl was his, Caleb climbing into our bed like gravity didn't apply to him. Instead, there was silence. Not peaceful silence. Wrong silence. The kind that makes your ears ring and your chest feel hollow. I lay there for a moment convincing myself it was early, that maybe they'd gone out, that maybe this was nothing. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I knew before I answered. I don't know how, but my body knew. The voice on the other end said my name slowly, like it might shatter. There had been an accident. A drunk driver. Route 9. They said my wife and children were involved. They said there were no survivors. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall while my brain tried to reject every word. I nodded even though no one could see me. I said okay. Because okay was what I had always said. Okay, I understand. Okay, I'll take care of it. Okay, don't worry. When the call ended, I sat there longer than I can remember, trying to understand what happens next when your entire life is erased in under a minute. Eventually, instinct took over. I called my parents. Because no matter how many times they disappointed me, there was still that child part of me that believed this was finally big enough for them to show up. I called my mother first. No answer. I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. There was music in the background. Laughter. The clink of glasses. I remember thinking how obscene that sounded. I told him slowly because the words felt foreign in my mouth. I told him Laura was dead. Ethan and Caleb too. Hit by a drunk driver. I told him I didn't know what to do. There was a pause. Not shock. Not panic. Just a pause. Then he said it. "Today is your sister's birthday. We can't come." For a second I thought I misheard him. I waited for the rest of the sentence. An apology. A question. Anything. But that was it. Those words didn't just end a phone call. They ended something in me. I hung up and stared at my phone like it had betrayed me too. I don't remember crying right away. I remember logistics. Police paperwork. Hospital confirmations. Identifications that no parent should ever have to make. I remember signing forms with shaking hands and thinking how strange it was that the world kept moving while mine had stopped. When it came time to plan the funeral, I called them again. I told them the date, the time. I told them I needed them there. My mother finally answered that time. She sounded distracted. She said they had already booked things for my sister's birthday weekend. Guests. Reservations. Plans. She said maybe we could do something later. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Something in me had gone very quiet. The funeral day arrived gray and cold. I stood there alone as 3 caskets were lowered into the ground. One for my wife. 2 impossibly small ones for my boys. I listened to strangers say kind words while the people who raised me chose balloons and cake instead. I remember thinking that this must be what it feels like to become an orphan as an adult. After that day, I stopped calling. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Grief stripped away the version of me that kept explaining myself, that kept forgiving first, that kept shrinking so others could feel comfortable. I sold the house because every room hurt. I quit my job because none of it mattered anymore. The insurance money came later. For $2 million. People think money fixes grief. It doesn't. But it does remove excuses. It gave me freedom. Space. Time. I didn't buy cars or post photos. I disappeared. I built something quietly. brick by brick. I worked when I couldn't sleep. I learned when the pain wouldn't let me rest. I poured everything I had left into building a life that didn't include people who only showed up when it was convenient. Months passed. Then one morning my phone exploded with missed calls. Messages from numbers I hadn't seen in half a year. My parents. My sister. Panic in every voicemail. Because my name was on the front page of the local paper. And suddenly, after everything, they wanted back in. After the article ran, everything changed overnight, not for me, but for them. I had already been living inside the silence for months, while they were only just discovering it existed. My phone lit up like a fire alarm, calls, texts, and voicemails stacking on top of each other. My mother crying. My father suddenly frantic. My sister sending messages that started with, "Hey stranger," like we had simply drifted apart, and not because they skipped my children's funeral. What struck me most wasn't the concern, it was the timing. None of them had checked on me when the house went dark, when the job disappeared, when I vanished from their lives entirely. But the second my name appeared next to words like founder, investor, acquisition, and eight-figure valuation, they remembered I existed. Suddenly, they needed to talk. They needed to explain. They needed to reconnect. I let it all ring for a full day before listening to a single voicemail, because grief teaches you patience in brutal ways. When I finally listened, I didn't hear remorse. I heard fear. My father's voice shook as he asked what I was doing now, who I was working with, why reporters were calling the house. My mother asked if I was okay now that I was successful. My sister asked if the rumors were true. That word, successful, stayed with me, because it was the first time they had ever used it about me. Growing up, I was the reliable one, the steady one, the safe one, never the impressive one. That role belonged to my sister, whose birthdays were events, whose disappointments were emergencies, whose needs were treated like gravity itself. In that moment, I realized they weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because they were afraid of what I had become without them. I ignored the calls another day, then another. For the first time in my life, I wasn't managing their emotions. I sat in my office, the one I built from nothing, staring out over a city that didn't know my past, and felt something close to peace. That's when I decided I would tell my story, but on my terms. Not the sanitized version they would eventually tell at dinner parties. Not the version where they claimed confusion or misunderstanding. The real one. The one that started long before the accident, long before the funeral, back when I learned exactly where I ranked in my own family, and why choosing myself still felt like betrayal. So let me take you back further, to when Laura noticed it before I did. She used to ask me why my parents only visited when my sister was involved, why every holiday revolved around her schedule, why my achievements were met with nods while hers were celebrated with banners. I defended them. I said that's just how they are, that they don't mean anything by it, that family is complicated. Laura would look at me with that quiet sadness she had when she knew I was lying to myself, and she'd say love isn't supposed to feel like a competition, Mark. I didn't listen, because ignoring patterns is easier than confronting them. When Ethan was born, then Caleb, I kept hoping my parents would finally shift, that holding my sons would wake something in them. It didn't. Birthdays were missed. Games were skipped. Calls stayed brief, unless my sister needed something. When the accident happened, it didn't create the betrayal. It exposed it. It stripped away the excuses and left nothing but the truth. Once that truth settled in, I stopped trying to soften it. I stopped rewriting the past in ways that made them look better and me look patient. I started seeing my life clearly, moment by moment, pattern by pattern, and the clarity hurt almost as much as the loss itself. Because it meant admitting that the funeral wasn't an exception. It was the final confirmation. Growing up, my sister was the center of every room. Her interests became family interests. Her problems became family emergencies. If she was upset, everything stopped. If I was struggling, I was told I was strong enough to handle it. I learned early that love in our house was conditional, and the condition was convenience. I learned not to ask for too much, not to take up space, not to compete. When I brought home good grades, my father nodded. When my sister did, there were dinners and photos. When I got my first promotion, my mother asked if it meant I'd be busier. When my sister quit a job, they helped cover her rent. I told myself that's just how families are, that someone always ends up being the responsible one. Laura saw it differently. She saw how tense I became before family gatherings. how I apologized for things that weren't my fault, how I kept hoping that the next milestone would finally make them proud. She used to tell me that I didn't owe anyone my silence. I brushed it off, because silence had kept the peace for most of my life. After the funeral, the silence became something else. It became a boundary. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I simply stopped reaching out. Days passed, then weeks. No one came to check on me. No one showed up at the empty house. No one asked how I was surviving without my wife, without my children. And that absence spoke louder than any argument ever could. I began building my new life in that quiet. I read obsessively. I learned skills I had put off for years. I worked until exhaustion forced sleep. Some nights I cried. Some nights I felt nothing at all. Grief came in waves, but so did clarity. I realized that the version of me who kept waiting for approval had died alongside my family. The man who remained didn't need permission. When the business started to grow, I didn't celebrate. I focused. I kept my circle small. I trusted actions, not words. And when the attention came, I didn't reach out to share it. Because success doesn't repair relationships that were never built on respect. It only reveals them. By the time the calls turned into visits, I had already rebuilt myself into someone they didn't recognize, and that was the part that scared them most. It started subtly at first. My mother showed up at my office unannounced, standing in the lobby like she belonged there, asking the receptionist for me by name as if she hadn't ignored my existence for months. When I finally came down, she tried to hug me. I stepped back, not dramatically, just enough to make the message clear. She looked confused, then hurt, then defensive, cycling through emotions the way she always had when things didn't go her way. She told me they hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She said birthdays are important too. She said they thought I needed space. She said grief makes people misunderstand things. I listened quietly, hands folded, waiting for something that never came. No apology, no ownership, just explanations that centered their comfort, not my loss. When she finished, I told her calmly that I had buried my entire family alone, and that nothing said after that could undo it. She cried then, real tears this time, but even those felt late, like flowers left on a grave long after the body is gone. Word spread quickly after that. My sister texted paragraphs about how hard it had been for her too, how the family dynamic had always been complicated, how she wished we could all heal together. I asked her one question. Where were you the day your nephews were buried? She never answered. My father tried a different approach. He invited me to lunch, chose a nice place, spoke in measured tones. He talked about legacy, about family businesses, about how proud he was of what I'd accomplished. He said he always knew I'd do something big. That almost made me laugh. Almost. I reminded him that pride expressed only after success isn't pride, it's opportunism. That conversation ended quietly. No shouting, no closure, just two men sitting across from each other, finally honest about who the other one was. After that, they stopped pushing directly. Instead, they tried the indirect route. Extended relatives reached out. Old family friends suddenly remembered my number. People who hadn't attended the funeral sent messages about how inspiring my story was. I ignored most of it, not because I was bitter, but because I was done performing resilience for people who treated tragedy like entertainment. Behind the scenes, my life kept expanding. The company grew faster than I expected. Opportunities stacked up. I hired carefully, partnered cautiously, and kept my name clean. Every decision I made was filtered through one question. Would this honor the life I lost, or distract me from it? I carried Laura's voice with me in everything. Her insistence on fairness. Her intolerance for excuses. Her quiet strength. I didn't build what I built out of revenge. I built it out of refusal. Refusal to stay small. Refusal to keep apologizing. Refusal to let the worst day of my life be the thing that defined me. Some nights were still brutal. Grief doesn't disappear when life improves. It just changes shape. There were moments I'd reach for my phone to text Laura about a win, then remember there was no one on the other side. Moments I'd hear a laugh that sounded like Ethan's, or see a kid Caleb's age in a grocery store and have to leave my cart behind. But there was strength in knowing that the people who mattered most to me never doubted my worth. They loved me without conditions. And once you've known that kind of love, you stop accepting substitutes. The last time I heard from my parents was a holiday card. Neutral, polite, signed with love. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Some doors close not because you slam them, but but because you finally stop holding them open. I don't hate my family. I simply no longer need them to validate my existence. I learned too late that being related doesn't guarantee loyalty, and that showing up matters more than saying you care. If there's anything I've taken from all of this, it's this. Pay attention to who shows up when there's nothing to gain. Those are your people. Everyone else is just noise. By the time a full year had passed, the panic in their voices had been replaced with something colder, something more strategic, and that shift told me everything I needed to know. Grief had stripped them of excuses, but time gave them distance, and distance gave them confidence. They stopped asking how I was and started asking what I planned to do next. They wanted meetings, not conversations. Proposals, not apologies. My father sent an email instead of calling, formal, structured, like he was pitching to a client. He talked about family alignment, about keeping success within the bloodline, about how my mother worried that outsiders were influencing me. That word, outsiders, landed hard. Laura had been called an outsider once too, early in our marriage, back when my parents still pretended their resistance was concern. Reading that email, I realized they hadn't changed at all. They had just adjusted their tactics. They weren't trying to reconnect with me as a son. They were trying to reinsert themselves into something valuable. I didn't reply. Silence had become my most honest language. A few weeks later, my sister reached out again, this time asking to meet privately. She chose a cafe halfway between our cities, neutral ground, public enough to keep things civil. She arrived late, like she always had, sat down without apologizing, and immediately started talking. She said she felt like the family had been punished enough. She said everyone grieves differently. She said I was holding on to anger that would poison me if I didn't let it go. I listened, calmly, patiently, the way I used to. When she finished, I asked her a single question. Had she ever once said my children's names out loud since they died? She froze. Then she said of course she had, but she couldn't tell me when. That was my answer. I told her forgiveness doesn't require reconnection, and grief doesn't obligate access. She accused me of being cold. I told her I had learned from the best. That meeting ended with her leaving in tears, and me sitting there feeling lighter than I had in months. Not victorious, just done. As the second year unfolded, my life settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar. Mornings were quiet. Work was demanding but meaningful. I volunteered anonymously with organizations that helped families impacted by drunk driving, not for recognition, but because channeling the pain outward kept it from turning inward. I met people who knew nothing about my past, who judged me only by how I showed up in the present. That was a gift I hadn't realized I was missing. Occasionally, guilt crept in, not about cutting contact, but about surviving, about laughing again, about planning a future that didn't include the people I lost. Survivor's guilt is strange that way. It whispers that joy is betrayal. I learned to talk back to it. I reminded myself that Laura would have wanted me to live fully, not shrink in mourning. That Ethan and Caleb deserved a father who carried their memory forward with strength, not self-erasure. On the anniversary of the accident, I visited the graves alone. I told them about the company, about the work, about the life I was building. I told them I was trying. I told them I missed them every day. And for the first time since the funeral, the pain felt quieter, more settled, like it had found a place to rest. That night, I received a message from my mother. It was short. She said she hoped I was healing. She said family is forever. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. Family isn't defined by time or blood. It's defined by presence, by showing up when it costs you something. The people who chose convenience over compassion forfeited the right to define me. I no longer measure my life by their approval or absence. I measure it by integrity, by peace, by the quiet knowledge that I didn't abandon myself when it mattered most. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about revenge or success or cutting people off. It's about recognizing when love is conditional and choosing not to live on conditions that diminish you. Loss taught me that life can end without warning. Betrayal taught me that not everyone deserves access to your grief. And rebuilding taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away, not in anger, but in truth. By the third year, the story people thought they knew had completely separated from the life I was actually living, and that distance mattered more than I expected. Publicly, I had become a symbol. Articles framed me as resilient, disciplined, unstoppable. They loved the contrast. Tragedy followed by success. Loss turned into legacy. People need narratives that make pain feel useful. Privately, my life was quieter, heavier, more deliberate. I woke up early because sleep still didn't come easily. Some mornings I sat on the edge of the bed and had to remind myself where I was, who I was now, what version of reality I'd woken into. Grief doesn't announce itself loudly after a while. It sneaks in through habits. Empty chairs, extra groceries bought by mistake, thoughts that start with "I should tell Laura" and then collapse halfway through. I learned to live with that. Not overcome it. Live with it. There's a difference no one really talks about. The company crossed a threshold that year. Bigger offices. More employees. Lawyers, boards, advisors. People who spoke in projections and exit strategies. I played the role they needed me to play, but I never let the work consume the why. Every major decision still passed through the same quiet filter. Would this pull me closer to the man my sons believed I was? Would this respect the life Laura and I were building before it was stolen? I didn't chase growth blindly. I avoided shortcuts. I said no to deals that smelled like ego instead of substance. That restraint confused people. They assumed trauma had made me cautious. They were wrong. Trauma had made me precise. That precision extended to relationships. I kept my circle small. Intentionally small. I stopped confusing proximity with trust. I stopped explaining my boundaries. I stopped rewarding persistence. The people who stayed were the ones who didn't push, who didn't ask for my story like it was a password to intimacy. They let me be quiet when I needed to be quiet. They didn't flinch when grief surfaced unexpectedly. They didn't try to fix it. They respected it. That kind of respect changes you. It recalibrates what you tolerate. My parents, meanwhile, continued orbiting at a distance, occasionally visible, never close. I heard about them through relatives, through secondhand updates that always carried a tone of confusion. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't just move on, why success hadn't softened me, why money hadn't made forgiveness automatic. They mistook boundaries for punishment. They mistook silence for cruelty. They never once asked themselves what it cost me to maintain contact with people who had taught me I was optional. That self-reflection would have required them to confront something uncomfortable. So they didn't. At one point, a cousin forwarded me a message thread I wasn't meant to see. My parents discussing me like a problem to be solved, speculating about whether I was being influenced, whether grief had changed my personality, whether I was holding on to resentment to feel powerful. I read it without anger, without surprise, just a quiet confirmation that I had made the right choice. People who refuse to take responsibility will always search for explanations that protect their self-image, even if it means rewriting your pain as pathology. There were moments, I won't lie, when the weight of everything felt unbearable again. Late nights after long weeks. Anniversaries. Random Tuesdays when nothing specific was wrong, but everything felt heavy. On those nights, I didn't reach for distractions. I didn't numb myself. I sat with it. I let the grief move through me the way it needed to. I talked to my kids out loud sometimes, in the car, in empty rooms, telling them about ordinary things, about the world they didn't get to grow up in. I told Laura when I was tired, when I was scared, when I missed being known without explanation. Those conversations didn't heal me. They grounded me. I also learned something else during that time. Strength doesn't always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like refusal. Refusal to keep performing roles that cost you your sanity. Refusal to accept love that disappears when it's inconvenient. Refusal to keep bleeding quietly so others don't feel uncomfortable. Walking away wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was accepting that walking away was necessary. People often ask me now if I regret cutting contact, if I ever think about reconciliation. I answer honestly. I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret choosing peace over proximity. Reconciliation requires accountability, and accountability requires humility. Without those, all you're doing is reopening a wound and calling it healing. I won't do that. Not for tradition. Not for appearances. Not for people who had a chance and made their choice. What surprised me most wasn't how much I lost. It was how much space opened up once I stopped trying to earn love from people who rationed it. That space allowed me to breathe again, to build again, to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what I'd been denied. I didn't become hard. I became clear. And clarity is dangerous to people who benefit from your confusion. If you're reading this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, let me say this plainly. You are not obligated to keep showing up for people who consistently show you where you rank. You are not required to keep forgiving without change. You are not selfish for choosing a life that doesn't revolve around managing other people's feelings at the expense of your own. Grief taught me that life is fragile. Betrayal taught me that loyalty is a choice. Rebuilding taught me that sometimes the most powerful legacy you can create is breaking a pattern that should have ended long before it reached you. I didn't lose my family the day of the accident. I lost them the day they chose celebration over presence. Everything after that was just me learning how to live without pretending otherwise. By the fourth year, something unexpected happened. The anger I thought would live in me forever finally burned itself out. Not because they apologized. Not because anything was repaired. It burned out because anger needs fuel, and once I stopped feeding it with hope, it had nothing left to consume. Hope is the most dangerous thing in a broken family. It convinces you to wait, to explain again, to endure one more disappointment because maybe this time will be different. When hope died, peace took its place. Uneven at first, fragile, but real. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped imagining what I would say if they ever truly listened. I stopped drafting speeches they would never hear. That mental space, once freed, felt enormous, almost overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been spent in silent rehearsal, preparing to justify my pain to people who never asked to understand it. Without that burden, my thoughts slowed. My body relaxed in ways it hadn't since childhood. I slept better. I laughed without immediately feeling guilty. I noticed beauty again. The company continued to grow, but it stopped being the centerpiece of my identity. It became a part of my life, not the proof of my worth. That distinction mattered. I hired leaders who cared about people, not optics. I built systems that rewarded integrity, not just performance. I refused to create a culture where success required emotional neglect, because I knew exactly what that kind of neglect cost over time. Employees noticed. Retention skyrocketed. People did their best work when they felt safe. That lesson wasn't theoretical to me. It was personal. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a small conference. Nothing flashy. Just a room full of people building things from scratch. After my talk, a man approached me. He looked exhausted. He told me he hadn't spoken to his parents in years. He said he thought success would fix it. He asked me if it ever does. I told him the truth. Success doesn't heal fractures. It just makes them easier to see. He nodded like someone who already knew the answer, but needed permission to accept it. We talked for a while. When he left, he thanked me for not sugarcoating it. That moment stayed with me. I began to understand that telling the truth, plainly and without cruelty, was its own form of service. Not everyone needs advice. Some people just need confirmation that what they're feeling isn't weakness. That walking away doesn't make them ungrateful. That love doesn't require self-abandonment. I started sharing more openly, not for sympathy, but for clarity. The messages that came back were overwhelming. People carrying stories they'd never told anyone. Parents who chose favorites and couldn't understand why their families fractured. Adult children drowning in guilt for choosing themselves. The pattern was everywhere once I knew how to see it. My parents attempted one final reach that year. No drama, no confrontation, just an invitation to a family gathering. Neutral language. No acknowledgement of the past. No mention of the funeral. No mention of the years of silence. It was an offer to reset without reckoning. I declined. Politely. Briefly. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I didn't leave the door cracked. I closed it gently, firmly, and without apology. That response felt like growth. Not reactive. Not defensive. Just honest. People often misunderstand what closure looks like. They imagine conversations, tears, mutual understanding. Sometimes closure is simply the absence of further harm. Sometimes it's choosing not to participate in cycles that require your pain to function. I didn't need them to admit fault for me to move forward. I needed them to stop having access to parts of me they never protected. There were still moments of sadness. That never fully disappears. Watching other families gather effortlessly. Seeing grandparents with grandchildren who look like my boys would have. Feeling the weight of what could have been. I let those moments exist without turning them into self-punishment. Missing something doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're human. As time passed, I started imagining a future that wasn't just survival. New friendships deepened. Purpose expanded beyond work. I traveled. I volunteered more openly. I mentored younger founders who reminded me of who I used to be, eager and apologetic, brilliant and unsure. I told them what I wish someone had told me earlier. You don't have to earn your place in the world by shrinking. You don't have to stay loyal to people who only value you when you're useful. You don't have to bleed quietly to prove you're strong. The legacy I'm building now has nothing to do with headlines or numbers. It's quieter than that. It's the legacy of choosing presence over performance, of valuing consistency over approval, of breaking a pattern that would have otherwise passed through me and into my children. In that way, even in their absence, Laura, Ethan, and Caleb saved me. They forced me to stop living halfway. They made it impossible to keep pretending. If you've read this far, and you're still questioning whether you're allowed to step away from people who hurt you simply because they share your blood, hear this clearly. You are allowed. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to stop explaining. You are allowed to outgrow the version of yourself that survived by enduring. Growth doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like release. I didn't become who I am because my family believed in me. I became who I am because I finally believed myself when the truth was undeniable. And once you do that, once you trust your own experience over the narratives others try to impose, there's no going back, only forward. By the 5th year, I stopped measuring time in anniversaries and started measuring it in moments of steadiness, the quiet proof that I had built a life capable of holding both grief and meaning at the same time. That balance didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A morning where I woke up without bracing for pain. An afternoon where I laughed and didn't immediately apologize to myself for it. An evening where the memories felt warm instead of sharp. Those moments didn't erase the loss. They softened the edges, and I learned to trust them. People still projected their own narratives onto my life. Some saw me as a cautionary tale. Others saw me as inspiration. Very few saw me as a man who had simply made a series of necessary choices. That's fine. I stopped needing to be understood by everyone. Understanding from the wrong people is a hollow victory. What mattered was alignment. Between my values and my actions. Between who I was becoming and who I refused to be again. I moved to a different city that year. Not to escape memories, but to give them room to breathe. The old streets carried too much weight. Every corner had a ghost. In the new place, I could walk without constantly tripping over the past. I chose a home that felt intentional. Light. Simple. No excess. I kept only what mattered. The boys' drawings. Laura's notes. A few objects that carried real meaning. Everything else was noise. Letting go of physical clutter mirrored something internal. I wasn't hoarding emotional debt anymore. My parents tried once more to reach out after hearing about the move. A short message. Neutral tone. Asking for my address. I didn't respond. Access is earned through consistency, not entitlement. They never demonstrated the former, only assumed the latter. That boundary no longer felt like an act of resistance. It felt like maintenance, like locking your door at night. Not because you expect danger, but because peace requires structure. The work I did outside of business expanded too. I started funding scholarships quietly, supporting recovery programs, backing founders who built with empathy, not extraction. I never attached my name publicly. I didn't need the credit. I needed the impact to be real. Loss taught me how temporary applause is. Meaning lasts longer when it isn't performative. Occasionally, someone would ask if I was lonely. The question used to bother me. Now it made me pause. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, sometimes, but not lonely. There's a difference that only becomes clear once you've lived without emotional safety. Loneliness is being unseen. I was seen, by myself, by the people who mattered, by the work that aligned with who I was. Solitude became a choice, not a sentence. I dated briefly, carefully, without urgency. I was honest from the start. About my past. About my limits. About the fact that love, for me, would never be careless again. Some people couldn't handle that. They wanted lightness without depth. I didn't blame them. I simply didn't follow them there. Others understood immediately. They recognized the weight not as baggage, but as proof of capacity. I learned that compatibility isn't about shared interests. It's about shared respect for boundaries. One night, sitting alone on my balcony, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry at my parents anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I wasn't hoping for a future version of them that would finally show up. I had released them. Not forgiven in the traditional sense. Released. Their choices no longer occupied space in my daily thinking. That kind of freedom is hard to describe unless you've lived the opposite. People assume walking away is dramatic, that it's fueled by rage or ego. In reality, it's often quiet, boring even. It's a slow accumulation of moments where you choose not to engage, where you stop responding, where you invest your energy elsewhere. One day you look back and realize the distance is permanent, not because you declared it so, but because you stopped crossing it. If there's a through line in everything I've lived, it's this. Pay attention to what costs you peace. Then stop paying that price. Love that requires constant self-erasure is not love. Family that demands endurance without care is not family. Success that exists only to prove something to people who never showed up will never feel complete. I didn't rebuild my life to show anyone anything. I rebuilt it because the alternative was disappearing quietly, the way I had been taught to. I chose visibility in my own eyes. I chose alignment over approval. I chose a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. And if there's one thing I know now, without hesitation, it's this. You can lose everything and still find yourself. But you can't find yourself if you keep handing your worth to people who treat it like an inconvenience. By the 6th year, the absence of chaos had become the most unfamiliar thing in my life, and I had to learn how to live without constantly bracing for impact. For most of my adult years, tension had been the background noise, waiting for disappointment, anticipating the next subtle dismissal, preparing explanations no one asked for. When that finally stopped, when the noise faded, it left behind a strange quiet that felt almost suspicious at first. Peace can feel dangerous when you're used to instability. I had to remind myself daily that nothing was about to go wrong just because things were calm. That year, I started noticing how deeply the old patterns had shaped me, how often I minimized my needs without realizing it, how instinctively I offered understanding before anyone asked for it, how quickly I assumed responsibility for other people's discomfort. Healing wasn't about erasing those instincts. It was about catching them in real time and choosing differently. Pausing, asking myself whether the response I was about to give came from fear or from truth. Fear had run my life for a long time. Fear of being difficult, fear of being abandoned, fear of being ungrateful. Truth felt steadier, slower, stronger. I also began to understand something about grief that no one prepares you for. It doesn't just live in memories. It lives in identity. When Laura and the boys died, the man I was died too. The husband, the daily father, the version of me that had a clear script for the future. Rebuilding wasn't just about creating a new life. It was about allowing myself to become someone unfamiliar without treating that transformation as betrayal. There were moments when I felt disloyal for evolving, as if staying frozen in pain was the only way to prove my love was real. It took time to accept that love doesn't require stagnation. It requires remembrance. I started speaking more openly about loss, not publicly in a grand way, but privately, honestly, when it mattered, with people who earned the right to hear it. I stopped compressing the story to make others comfortable. I stopped offering the short version that skipped the hard parts. If someone asked how I was, and I trusted them, I told the truth. Some days were good. Some days were heavy. Most days were both. That honesty filtered my relationships quickly. The people who stayed didn't try to rush me through it. They didn't offer platitudes. They listened. They remembered names. They asked follow-up questions months later. That consistency mattered more than grand gestures ever could. My parents, at this point, existed more as an idea than a presence. I no longer reacted when I heard updates about them. No spike of anger. No wave of sadness. Just distance. Neutrality. That was how I knew something fundamental had shifted. Indifference isn't cruelty. It's closure without conversation. They still didn't understand. They probably never would. But understanding was no longer a requirement for my peace. One unexpected thing that year was how often people sought me out, not for business advice, but for permission. Permission to step away from families that hurt them. Permission to stop explaining their boundaries. Permission to accept that love without accountability is just control wearing a softer face. I never told anyone what to do. I told them what it cost me to stay silent for too long. I told them what it gave me to stop. People don't need instructions as much as they need examples. I revisited old journals around that time, things I had written years before the accident, pages filled with rationalizations, with hope that the next holiday would be different, that the next milestone would change the dynamic. Reading those words felt like meeting a younger version of myself who was trying so hard to earn something that should have been freely given. I felt compassion for him, not embarrassment. He did what he knew how to do to survive. I closed the journal and let that version of me rest. The business continued to thrive, but it stopped surprising me. Not because I took it for granted, but because I finally understood that success wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural result of focus, boundaries, and self-trust, things that had been systematically discouraged in my early life. When you remove constant emotional interference, growth becomes predictable, sustainable, quietly powerful. There were still moments of longing that never disappears completely. Seeing a father teaching his sons to ride bikes. Hearing a couple laugh in a way that felt intimate and effortless. On those days, I didn't spiral. I acknowledged the ache. I let it exist without trying to solve it. Grief doesn't always need resolution. Sometimes it just needs room. Toward the end of that year, I realized something simple but profound. I wasn't living in reaction anymore. My choices weren't shaped by what I was avoiding or proving. They were shaped by what felt aligned. That alignment became my compass. If something disturbed my peace, I stepped back. If something required me to abandon myself, I declined. No speeches, no guilt, just clarity. If you're still reading, and you're somewhere in the middle of your own breaking point, understand this. You don't need a catastrophic event to justify choosing yourself. You don't need permission from the people who benefit from your silence. You don't need to wait until the damage is irreversible. I waited too long because I thought endurance was virtue. It isn't. Discernment is. I didn't emerge from loss stronger in the way people like to romanticize. I emerged more honest, more selective, more grounded. I learned that peace is not the absence of pain, but the absence of unnecessary suffering. And most suffering, I learned, comes from staying where you are unseen, unheard, and consistently devalued. My life now isn't loud. It isn't performative. It isn't driven by revenge or validation. It's steady, intentional, real. And for the first time, that's more than enough. By the 7th year, I finally understood something that had taken most of my life to learn. Closure doesn't arrive as a moment. It arrives as a shift in gravity. One day you wake up and realize that the people who once occupied the center of your emotional world no longer pull you toward them. They exist, but they don't orient you. Their opinions don't tilt your decisions. Their absence doesn't ache the way it once did. You don't feel victorious. You feel free in a way that is quiet, almost invisible, but irreversible. That year forced me to confront a deeper truth. For a long time, I believed my pain came only from loss. From the accident. From the funeral. From the abandonment. But pain is rarely that simple. What hurt just as much was realizing how long I had trained myself to accept less than I deserved. How early I learned to disappear to keep the peace. How many times I told myself it wasn't that bad because admitting it was that bad would have meant changing everything. When you grow up being the expendable one, you don't just tolerate neglect. You normalize it. You internalize it. You become fluent in self-erasure. I started therapy seriously that year, not because I was falling apart, but because I was stable enough to look backward without collapsing. Stability gives you courage. In those sessions, I traced patterns I'd never named before. The way I overfunctioned. The way I apologized reflexively. The way I felt responsible for other people's emotional weather. None of it came from nowhere. It came from a childhood where love was inconsistent and attention was conditional. Naming that didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. Precision is healing. One exercise stayed with me. My therapist asked me to imagine my life if the accident had never happened. If Laura and the boys were still here. If everything had continued as it was. The question wasn't meant to torture me. It was meant to reveal something. And what it revealed shocked me. Even in that imagined future, I was still shrinking. Still compensating. Still hoping my parents would eventually choose me. Still teaching my children, unintentionally, that some people matter more than others. That realization broke something open in me. It didn't lessen my grief, but it reframed it. The tragedy didn't just end a life. It interrupted a cycle that would have quietly continued. That understanding changed how I carried the loss. It wasn't destiny. It wasn't a lesson sent by the universe. It was an unbearable accident. But what followed, what I chose to do with the aftermath, that part mattered. I stopped asking why it happened and started asking what kind of man I wanted to be because it happened. Not in a heroic way. In a grounded way. A way that didn't require constant justification. My relationship with success shifted again that year. I stopped seeing it as something fragile that could disappear if I relaxed. I trusted myself more. I delegated more. I built redundancy, not just in systems, but in identity. I wasn't just the founder. I wasn't just the survivor. I was a person with multiple dimensions, allowed to change, allowed to rest. That flexibility made me stronger than relentless drive ever did. I also began to understand forgiveness differently, not as absolution, not as reconciliation, but as release from repetition. I didn't forgive my parents by pretending nothing happened. I forgave by refusing to replay the same emotional script with them over and over. I stopped trying to extract accountability from people who weren't capable of offering it. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them limited. Accepting limitation is often the end of suffering. One afternoon, I ran into someone who knew my parents well. They told me my mother still talked about me often, that she didn't understand why I wouldn't come back, that she told people she had lost a son. I listened without reacting. Then I said something that surprised even me. I said maybe we both lost something, but only one of us was willing to look at why. And that was the end of the conversation. No anger, no explanation, just truth, stated plainly. As the year went on, I noticed how differently I showed up in the world. I didn't rush to fill silences. I didn't overextend myself. I didn't explain my boundaries unless someone genuinely needed to understand them. I chose relationships that felt reciprocal, not familiar. Familiarity had tricked me before. It felt like love, but it was just repetition. Reciprocity felt steadier, safer. There were moments when the weight of everything I'd lived pressed down hard again. Grief is not linear. It loops. It revisits. It surprises you. But the difference now was that I trusted myself to survive those moments without abandoning who I'd become. I didn't panic when the sadness returned. I sat with it. I let it pass through. I didn't confuse pain with danger anymore. Late one night, I reread the article that had started everything. The headline, the framing, the version of me the public had consumed. It felt distant, incomplete. That wasn't who I was anymore. That wasn't even who I had been then. Stories simplify because they have to. Lives don't. And I finally felt okay with being misunderstood by people who only knew fragments. My integrity didn't depend on their comprehension. If this part of my story resonates more than the tragedy itself, if the boundary setting feels louder than the loss, that's not an accident. Because most people don't fall apart from one catastrophic moment. They fall apart slowly from years of being unseen, undervalued, and emotionally starved. The tragedy just removes the final excuse to keep pretending. I didn't become whole again. That's a lie people like to tell. You don't replace what you lose. You integrate it. You carry it differently. You let it shape you without letting it consume you. And somewhere along the way, you stop asking who you were before and start honoring who you are now. This isn't the end of my story, but it is the point where I stopped needing an ending that included everyone. Sometimes the best part of a life isn't reconciliation. It's alignment. And alignment, once found, changes everything that comes after. By the 8th year, the question people asked most often had changed, and that shift said more than they realized. It was no longer, how did you survive? Or how did you rebuild? It became, do you ever feel normal again? I used to struggle with that question, because normal implies a return, and there is no return after certain kinds of loss. There is only adaptation, expansion, a new equilibrium that includes scars without being ruled by them. I stopped trying to measure my life against what it used to be and started measuring it against what felt honest. Honesty became my baseline. That year taught me that healing doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like grief without panic, sadness without collapse, memory without disorientation. You remember, and it hurts, but it doesn't derail you. You carry it and still move forward. That subtle distinction marked real progress. I could walk past families without feeling shattered. I could attend birthdays without resentment. I could hear children laugh and feel tenderness instead of only loss. The pain didn't disappear. It transformed. I also began to see how many people live trapped in emotional debt they didn't choose. Obligations inherited rather than earned. Roles assigned early and never questioned. I saw myself in them. The over-responsible sibling. The emotional buffer. The one who keeps the peace at their own expense. People would talk, and I could hear the strain beneath their words. They weren't asking for solutions. They were asking for permission to stop, permission to rest, permission to choose differently. Around that time, I was asked to mentor a group of young founders who had come from unstable homes. Brilliant, driven, exhausted people who believed worth had to be proven daily. I didn't talk to them about scaling or exits first. I talked to them about boundaries, about burnout, about how ambition can be a trauma response if you're not careful. They listened in a way that told me no one had ever framed success that way for them before. A few months later, one of them told me they'd gone no contact with a parent who kept sabotaging them emotionally. They weren't angry. They were relieved. That mattered more than any metric. My parents faded further into the background, not because they stopped existing, but because my nervous system stopped reacting to them. I could hear updates without internal commentary. I could pass holidays without emotional preparation. I could acknowledge their role in my life without letting it define me. That neutrality was earned. It came from repetition, from choosing myself over and over until it no longer felt like a rebellion. It felt like maintenance. There was a moment that year that crystallized everything. I was sitting at a dinner table with friends, people who knew my full story and never used it against me. Someone made a toast, spontaneous, unpolished. They thanked me for being steady, for showing up, for listening without trying to fix. As they spoke, I realized something quietly monumental. This is what family feels like. Not obligation, not guilt, presence, consistency, care without conditions. I excused myself afterward and sat alone for a minute, overwhelmed not by sadness, but by gratitude. Gratitude is complicated when you've lost so much. It can feel disloyal, but I learned that gratitude doesn't erase grief. It coexists with it. It honors what remains. It doesn't replace what was lost. It simply acknowledges that life still holds meaning. Allowing myself that realization felt like crossing a threshold I hadn't known was there. I also noticed how my internal voice had changed. It was quieter, kinder, less reactive. I didn't speak to myself the way my parents had spoken to me anymore. I no longer minimized my feelings or rushed myself through pain. I treated myself with the patience I had always offered others. That internal shift was one of the most profound changes of all. You can cut contact externally and still carry the voices inside. Silencing those takes longer. There were still hard days. Certain dates. Certain songs. Certain smells that brought everything rushing back. But the difference now was that I trusted my capacity to endure without spiraling. I didn't fear the grief anymore. I respected it. I knew it would rise and fall like weather, not consume me whole. If you're reading this part and wondering when the breaking stops, here's the truth most people won't tell you. It doesn't stop. It changes. The sharp edges dull. The weight redistributes. You stop bleeding, but you don't forget the wound. And that's okay. Forgetting isn't the goal. Living honestly is. I don't chase reconciliation anymore. I don't fantasize about apologies that will never come. I don't imagine alternate timelines where everyone suddenly understands. I live in the timeline that exists, and I make it meaningful. That choice saved me. This part of the story isn't dramatic. There are no confrontations, no reversals, no cinematic closure. It's quieter than that. It's the long middle where you learn how to live with what you know, where you stop explaining, where you stop asking permission, where you finally trust your own judgment. And that trust, once earned, becomes the foundation for everything that follows. By the 9th year, something settled into place that I didn't even realize I had been waiting for. It wasn't happiness in the way people like to package it, and it wasn't closure in the cinematic sense either. It was steadiness. A deep internal steadiness that didn't depend on circumstances lining up or people behaving the way I wished they would. I stopped checking my emotional footing every time something unexpected happened. I trusted myself to stay upright. That trust was earned slowly, through years of choosing alignment over appeasement, and once it took hold, it changed how everything felt. I noticed it first in small moments. Someone would cancel plans, and my body wouldn't tense. A disagreement would surface, and I wouldn't rush to smooth it over. Silence would stretch, and I wouldn't feel compelled to fill it. These used to be danger signals to me, cues that I needed to perform, manage, or retreat. Now they were just neutral events. Information, not threats. That was when I understood how much of my old life had been lived in quiet survival mode, even during periods that looked calm from the outside. Grief, by then, had become something like a companion I understood well. It didn't ambush me anymore. It arrived predictably, respectfully, and it left when it was done. I could talk about Laura and the boys without bracing myself. I could say their names without my chest tightening. I could remember specific details, the way Ethan scrunched his face when he was thinking hard, the way Caleb insisted on doing things himself, the way Laura listened with her whole body, and feel warmth alongside the ache. That coexistence felt like a milestone no one had prepared me for. It meant love had survived the loss intact. I also became more aware of how differently I related to other people's pain. I no longer tried to absorb it or fix it. I listened without taking responsibility for outcomes that weren't mine. That shift protected me in ways I hadn't known I needed. Compassion without self-sacrifice is a learned skill, especially for people raised to equate worth with usefulness. I practiced it deliberately, and the more I practiced, the lighter I felt. That year, I was asked again if I would consider reconnecting with my parents. The question came from someone well-meaning, someone who believed reconciliation was always the higher road. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel tempted. I simply answered honestly. I said reconciliation requires two people who are willing to see the same reality. We didn't, and I was no longer willing to distort mine to make theirs more comfortable. The conversation moved on, and so did I. I reflected a lot on identity during that time. Who I was when no one was watching. Who I was when there was nothing to prove. Stripped of reaction, stripped of performance, stripped of inherited obligation. What remained surprised me. I was quieter than I used to be, more observant, less impressed by intensity. I valued consistency now, over charisma, over declarations, over promises. People revealed themselves not in what they said, but in what they repeated. I trusted that pattern more than any explanation. There was a moment, sitting alone one evening, when I realized I had stopped asking what my life was supposed to look like. That question had governed so many of my choices for years. What would make sense? What would look right? What would be acceptable? Without noticing, I had replaced it with a different question entirely. Does this feel true? That question simplified everything. It didn't guarantee comfort, but it guaranteed coherence. And coherence is grounding in a way approval never is. I became more selective about the stories I told myself too. I stopped framing my past as a series of failures or mischances. I saw it instead as a series of adaptations. I did what I knew how to do at the time, with the information and capacity I had. That reframing didn't absolve anyone else. It simply freed me from carrying unnecessary blame. Accountability belongs where it belongs. Taking responsibility for everything is not maturity. It's erasure. I also noticed how rarely I thought about proving anything anymore. Success didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a byproduct. Relationships didn't feel like negotiations. They felt like exchanges. If something required too much justification, I stepped back. Not dramatically, just quietly. I trusted that what didn't fit didn't need to be forced. There were still moments of loneliness, but they were different now. They weren't rooted in rejection. They were rooted in absence. And absence is sad, but it isn't destabilizing. I could sit with it. I could acknowledge it without spiraling into old narratives about unworthiness or abandonment. I knew the difference now between being alone and being unwanted. That distinction changed everything. As this chapter of my life closed, I realized that the most radical thing I had done wasn't cutting contact or rebuilding or even surviving. It was choosing to believe my own experience without requiring external validation. I stopped outsourcing my sense of reality. I stopped waiting for permission to trust myself. That decision didn't make life perfect. It made it mine. This part of the story doesn't end with triumph or reconciliation or revenge. It ends with something quieter and more durable. Self-trust. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that holds steady even when the world doesn't make sense. And that, after everything, is enough to keep going. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below, and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.